Good afternoon. It is February 9th, 2010. I am Nancy Becker, and I am interviewing Louis B. Thurston III. This is an interview for the Project on the Governor, Kane Archive, profiling the career and administration of Thomas H. Kane. This interview is a follow-up to a lengthy and comprehensive interview conducted by Don Linke in February 2006. Lou, your biography and 40-year career in public service is included in the first interview with Don Linke, so I will not ask you to repeat it, and it is already up on the website.
Good.
Since this portion of the Project on the Governor is focused on the Kane years, I would like our discussion to center on your relationship with him from the time he successfully ran for governor in 1981. But I want to backtrack just a little. When Tom Kane ran for governor in 1977, his losing campaign, were you involved in that campaign at all?
No, I wasn't. As a matter of fact, I worked for Ray Bateman, his primary opponent at that time.
And then after the 1977 campaign, where everybody thought that Ray Bateman would be the candidate, but in fact Governor Byrne was reelected for a second term, what did you do?
Well, at that time, I was the executive director of the Election Law Enforcement Commission, and we were very busy administering the first publicly financed gubernatorial campaign in the United States between Governor Byrne and Ray Bateman. And even though Ray had wanted me to work in his campaign, I had made a commitment to run the Election Law Enforcement Commission, and so I did that throughout the campaign.
Well, tell us, I recall those years, so tell us a little bit about those efforts, because at that time, if I remember correctly, this was one of the first public financing programs for governor in the United States, so clearly that must have been a huge challenge.
It was a real challenge to get it right, and we had both candidates participate in the public financing, so that was significant. And our agency had the responsibility to administer the program, and we didn't have anybody else to go by because we were the first to do it. One of the interesting things that happened during that campaign was that there was a complaint filed with us alleging that the rebate checks for the income tax, which Governor Byrne's office had put out with the state treasury, were campaign, the expenses for that were campaign contributions against the expenditure limit for the campaign. And the Election Law Enforcement Commission had to make a determination about that. And we had a very difficult time making that determination, but finally determined that they were not, which actually pleased Governor Byrne and didn't please Ray Bateman.
And at that time, primary campaigns were not included in the public financing system.
Yes, that's right.
That happened later.
Yes.
As a legislator, was Tom Kane supportive of these election law reform efforts?
As I recall, I think that he was. I don't remember specifically how he might have voted, but I think he was supportive.
Mm-hmm. So now let's jump ahead to the gubernatorial election of 1981. When did you become involved in the primary campaign?
Well, I left the Election Law Enforcement Commission and went back to my former position as executive director of the state Senate, which was a partisan position, and I did that because I wanted to get involved in the gubernatorial election. So I got involved in the general election for governor as an advisor in the campaign, and worked through the summer and into the fall, and then we had the election, and Governor Kane got elected.
Let me step back a minute. Did you work in the primary campaign?
No, I did not.
Because as I recall, Tom Kane was not the favored candidate to win. In fact, it was Pat Kramer.
Right. That's correct. I didn't join the campaign until the general election.
Mm-hmm. So once Kane won the primary, what was your role in the campaign?
It was largely to be an advisor on major issues that developed in the campaign. I had previously served as research director for a successful campaign by Governor Cahill a number of years before. So my emphasis was on the research and the issues and that kind of thing.
Clearly, the 1981 election was one of the closest in New Jersey history. What was your role, first of all, during that period of uncertainty when it was not clear who the victor would be?
Well, I guess I would start with election night. We had a campaign headquarters in Parsippany, and we were there, and we were anxiously awaiting the returns. And as they came in, it was evident it was going to be an extremely close election. And it got pretty late at night. It was midnight and later, and we still didn't know what the outcome was going to be. And I had planned that evening to participate in that program and then go home to my home in Lawrenceville. It became clear that I was going to have to stay overnight. And finally, I left about 1:30 in the morning. I left the campaign celebration, and not knowing who had won the election, and I went looking for a place to sleep. And I had to stop at about 3 or 4 different motels before I finally found a room.
So during that period of time of uncertainty, what role did you play with it wasn't a transition yet, it was just a group of people trying to find out if in fact Tom Kean was the victor? Well,
I went to bed election night very late, got up the next morning, and I called Governor Kean. He wasn't governor then, he was just Tom Kean, at his home. And I said, I have the transition report that I had prepared along with Gary Stein. Was a document that we had put together over the summer to outline all the things that you'd have to do if you won the election in the transition. And I said, I have this transition report. Do you want it now, or what should I do with it? And he said, bring it over to the house. And I was in Parsippany, and I drove over to Livingston with the campaign transition report in my hand. And it turned out I spent the whole day with the governor. Chris Daggett and I spent the whole day with the governor and his wife and some personal friends. And went to a press conference after a while in the afternoon, and we were still uncertain as to who had won the election. But we felt fairly confident that he was going to win.
So once the results were certified and Kean was declared the winner, what was your role in the transition? I mean, clearly you had already prepared this comprehensive document.
Well, the governor, shortly after the election, decided to put a transition committee together. And he asked Nick Brady and myself to be co-chairs of the transition committee. So I accepted that position, and it turned out that I then worked from a day or two after the election right until the governor took office in that role as chair of the transition. Getting very little sleep and being very, very busy and in a very intensive effort.
Because it was so foreshortened. Because of when, in fact, was Kean declared the victor?
There was a recount that was authorized, and so they went through that process, and what we had was a bifurcated transition in the sense that we had a team of people, I believe led by Roger Bodman, who had been the campaign manager, and by some attorneys, including Erwin Kimmelman, who later became the Attorney General. They were working on the recount and making sure that everything was done so that the recount would come out in the governor's favor. At the same time, Nick Brady and I and others were working on putting the administration together with the transition, and that was our job. So we had parallel efforts that were going forth at the same time, and it actually worked pretty well.
When you were asked to be chief of staff, tell us how that unrolled. Who called you? Were you surprised?
Well, I was interested in that kind of position. I thought it would be something that I was well prepared for because I had worked in state government and politics and was interested. And the governor, I believe, at his house one day asked me if I would take that position, and I readily accepted that. So that was the beginning of staffing the new administration, the governor's office, and so forth. And our job was to, at that point with the transition, put together a new administration with 20 different cabinet officers and all the other people that had to staff it.
Will you describe how that worked? I understand that a decision was also made to hire a headhunter, which was unusual for a gubernatorial administration. How did that work? How did hiring or recruiting cabinet members work? Spend a little time and describe it to us.
Well, the governor knew a man in Morris County, I believe, who ran a search firm, and so he indicated he wanted to use that firm to help us identify some executives that might be potential cabinet officers. So we started that effort, and at the same time we had a personnel committee within the transition committee that also worked at the same time to identify people, particularly people that were well known to us through politics, that had some political experience or experience in the subject areas for the various cabinet positions. And so we worked together, and there were a few candidates who were identified by the search firm who we eventually hired, and most of the people did not go through that process. Most of the cabinet members were people that we had some knowledge of, had worked in the campaign, that kind of thing. And those people were the ones that were hired for most of the cabinet positions.
Tell us about some of the individual cabinet members, how they were hired, how they were chosen. I think we'd love to hear some of those stories.
Well,
because the Kane cabinet was clearly a very strong cabinet.
We felt good about the cabinet. I think the governor was pleased with the results, that we had good people. And we had a diversity of people. We actually had 3 Democrats among the cabinet members, and our treasurer, Ken Biederman, and our Human Services Director, George Albanese, and our public advocate, Joe Rodriguez. All of them were part of the administration. That was unusual because usually you would just pick all the people from your own party and not reach out to others. But we felt it was a good thing to do, and it turned out to be very good.
Now, these 3 individuals, the treasurer, Biederman, George Albanese, and Rodriguez, did they come through the recruiting firm, or did they come through knowledge of people in New Jersey?
Both. Ken Biederman basically, I believe, he was first identified by a recruiting firm. He was working in the state of Delaware, and he came in. And then we had George Albanese was somebody who was identified to us, as I recall, by Tony Ciccatello, who was a close friend of the governor's and a key member of our personnel committee. And Joe Rodriguez was somebody who I suggested, who was he had been the president of the State Bar Association and well-known South Jersey person. So, and he was Hispanic as well, which was good.
It was, although it was unusual to have 3 Democrats in the cabinet at that time, there was still a spirit of bipartisanship that existed during the Kane administration. that in subsequent administrations seems to have eroded. Will you talk about that a little bit?
We started out with the Democratic Party controlling both houses of the legislature, and it became clear that we needed to work closely with the people who were controlling the legislature on legislation. The governor had served in the Assembly for a number of years and had been Speaker of the Assembly, and so he knew a lot of the people personally, and that was very, very helpful. And I also had known a lot of them through my previous service. The governor established a good rapport with Alan Karcher, who was the Assembly Speaker, and Carmen Orecchio, who was the President of the Senate. Carmen Orecchio was from the same county as the governor, Essex County, and Alan Karcher and the governor, while they publicly battled over lots of issues, shared lots of other interests, things like opera, books that they had read, and various other kinds of personal interests.
Will you talk about some of the other cabinet members that were appointed that may not have come through the headhunter recruiting process?
Sure. I'll mention a couple. When the governor first got started, he went to Washington to meet with President Reagan, and Nick Brady and I accompanied him to Washington, and we went down the night before, and we were sitting in the hotel talking, and we started talking about different cabinet officers and what we were going to do. And I said to the governor, I have an idea which you may think is crazy, but listen to my argument. I said, I think that we should appoint Roger Bodman, who had been the chairman of the campaign, but who was a 28 or 29-year-old person without a whole lot of business management experience. I said, I think we should make him labor commissioner. And the governor said, labor commissioner? Why that? And I said, here's my reason. He's very good at political negotiations. Labor unions negotiate all the time. He will establish good rapport with the labor unions. And he's too young and inexperienced at this point to take on a major management role with a larger department. And the governor said, well, I'll think about it. And shortly after that, the governor named Roger Bodman to be the labor commissioner. Subsequently, Roger got promoted to be the transportation commissioner when he had more management experience. So that was how we handled that kind of situation. Another key cabinet office was the commissioner of transportation initially. And from day one, my candidate for that position was John Sheridan, who had served as my counsel in the Senate when I was executive director of the Senate. I knew John very well. He knew transportation issues. He knew the political system. And the governor said, well, I'll think about that. And he said, I want you to go out and find a transportation expert, someone who was like former Commissioner Lou Gambaccini. And so I scoured the country looking for a transportation expert, interviewed people in New York hotel rooms and other places, and really was looking for this kind of expert who would fit well in New Jersey. And we really didn't find anybody. And time went on, and we had filled all the other positions, and we were down. This was the very last position we had in the cabinet to be filled. So one day the governor said to me, okay, he said, we have to fill this position right away. He said, I'll go with your guy, Sheridan. I said, okay, you won't regret it. And about a year later, the governor, in a conversation with me one day, said, you know, I think we have a very good cabinet, but I think John Sheridan's the best guy we have in the cabinet.
Talk about education and the Department of Environmental Protection, two areas that the governor always cared about.
This is an interesting story about education because the governor, as you said, had a very strong personal interest. we had a multi-layer level interview process for Commissioner of Education, which involved 6 people from within the administration. And it got narrowed down to 3 final candidates. And so I said to the governor, we have 3 candidates, and I said, what do you want to do at this point? And he said, well, give me a recommendation. Talk to the other 5 people and give me a recommendation as to which of the 3 you think is best, and I'll interview that person. I said, okay. So I went to the other 5 people, all of whom were prominent people in the campaign and in the transition. And it turned out that I couldn't get a consensus. I had 2 votes for each of the 3 candidates among the 6 of us. So the governor, I went back and reported this to Tom, and he said, well, I'll interview all 3. I have a strong interest in education. I said, fine. So he did. He interviewed all 3, and he decided that he wanted to appoint a fellow named Ron Lewis, who was the Deputy Commissioner of Education in Pennsylvania at that point, to be our new commissioner. So that was fine. The governor interviewed the 3 candidates. He liked Ron. We made a public announcement that he was going to be the new Commissioner of Education. And a week later, Bob Braun of the Star-Ledger newspaper, a columnist for education, wrote a story saying that Mr. Lewis had plagiarized his PhD dissertation, which, as you can imagine, created a real furor. So what to do at this point? Chris Daggett, who was the Deputy Chief of Staff, had a master's degree in education. And I said, Chris, your job now is to go read the dissertation. So he went out the next day, ran down the dissertation, read it, went through, came back, and said, Braun was right. He did plagiarize part of the dissertation. So, what do we do now? So the governor said, I want you to go talk to Mr. Lewis. So I got on a helicopter along with, I brought Gary Stein and Chris Daggett with me, and we went to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and we met with Mr. Lewis, and we said, this is a real difficult situation. He, at that point, understood that and readily decided to withdraw as a candidate. So that was not a pleasant thing to have to go through. Came back, announced to the public that Mr. Lewis had withdrawn. So now we still need a Commissioner of Education. So I said, Governor, what do you want to do now? And he said, well, I'll go with one of the other 2 candidates. It turned out the one that I had favored was Saul Cooperman. So I called Saul up and told him that while he was not our first choice, clearly, everybody knew that, he was our choice at that point, and he readily accepted to be Commissioner of Education.
And talk a little bit about Saul's career in the administration. I believe he remained in the Kane administration for all of the 8 years, and was really a strong advocate for reform in education.
He was very much a strong advocate for reform. He had excellent experience because he had been superintendent of 3 different school systems in New Jersey. He talked philosophically, which sometimes put the governor off. But in addition, he could be very practical, and he was very dedicated to reforms in education. And so he and the governor had a good rapport, and he stayed through the administration for the 8 years, as you said.
Would you also talk about the Commissioner of DEP?
Well, a lot of people didn't realize that Tom Kane, when he was an assemblyman, had sponsored the legislation that created the State Department of Environmental Protection. So he had a very strong interest, and he had a strong interest in the sense of the old idea of conservation, that was used before we got into using the term environmental protection. So he had a very strong interest in this, and we had a number of candidates that were suggested for the position. And there was one candidate named Bob Huey, who was originally suggested to us by Senator Bill Gormley from Atlantic County, and Bob was from the southern part of the state. And so we called him in for an interview, and Tony Ciccatello and I interviewed Mr. Huey, and he came in, and unlike so many of the other candidates who wore their interview suits and were all dressed up and everything else, Mr. Huey came in dressed very casually and sat there and was very informal compared to everybody else. So Tony and I asked him lots of questions, and we knew the subject pretty well. So we asked a lot of good questions, and we kept getting one good answer after another. He was excellent. So we thanked him, and we said, well, we'll talk to the governor, we'll get back to you. We went to see the governor and said, we have this guy from Ocean County, from Atlantic County, who is very informal, very different than a lot of the other people, but I think you'll like him. And so we recommended that he interview him. So the governor interviewed him, and we hired him. And he was a very good environmental protection commissioner.
Are there any other cabinet members that stand out in your mind who were strong and who came through the normal political process?
Oh, let's see. I'm not sure the others were so notable. We had some people who had come from business. Our commissioner of commerce, and we then had some. We had the attorney general, who was an outstanding lawyer in Essex County, and the governor knew him very well. He had also served in the assembly with him, and so most of the other picks were people who the governor knew. One person who was not well known, but the governor knew him because he was from Essex County, was Len Coleman, who we hired as the energy commissioner.
Will you talk a little bit about Len's career in the administration?
He started out as the energy commissioner, and he didn't have a strong background in energy, but he was a person who had a lot of energy, and he was younger. He was interested in learning. He had good insights into the political process. And after a while, he moved over from the energy job to be Commissioner of Community Affairs. And I think he was more comfortable doing that, where he had a chance to interact with people throughout the state and various communities, and serve the governor well in that respect.
And if I recall correctly, he was one of the people largely responsible for the politics of inclusion, the outreach to the minority and the urban communities during the Kaine administration.
One of Governor Kaine's strong points is that over the years he had a lot of knowledge of people in various communities throughout the state, and he had friends in all these different ethnic communities, and Len Coleman was helpful to him, particularly with the black community, but others as well, in fostering support for the administration and its programs.
And I believe that Governor Kaine, certainly in the second election, where he was elected by a much greater majority than the first election, that he won a very, very significant majority of the black vote.
The governor did, and it was because of the assistance of a lot of people, but also personally, his efforts to spend time with people in various communities, and there were a number of people who had the governor knew over the years, and they from these various communities, and he would take the time to work with people. One of the things that this reminds me of was trying to run the governor's schedule. My job as chief of staff was to oversee the governor's schedule every day, and he was always running behind. And the primary reason he ran behind was because he would take an interest in people, and he would talk to people at length. And he did not brush people off. He did not shake hands with somebody and move on to the next person quickly. He would take the time to talk to people and learn about their interests and their problems. But it was difficult to keep them on schedule. So that was always a challenge for us.
Let me go back to the cabinet for one more minute, and then I want to talk to you about your job as chief of staff. Were the cabinet members given free rein to hire any staff they wanted, or were people suggested to them?
Both, really. We tried to take people who had been supportive of the governor through the campaign and otherwise, and people he knew from the legislature and other areas, and put them in key positions throughout each of the departments. So in some cases we suggested that they be hired by the various cabinet people. In other cases, the cabinet people knew key people in business and other areas, academia, and they wanted to bring those people in. So it was a combination of that.
So let's now talk about your job as chief of staff. Clearly, we're back. We just took a break, and I started to ask Lou, tell me about your job as chief of staff. Clearly an overwhelming job. What were your responsibilities in addition to helping select the cabinet and doing the governor's schedule? What else were you responsible for?
Well, the schedule took an awful lot of the time. And we also had responsibility for running various programs from the governor's office. There were some things that we did in that respect. Also overseeing the public relations for the whole administration that was there, and coordinating the legal services with the governor's chief counsel and the longer range policy developments with the Office of Policy and Planning. All of that was in the governor's office, and so we had responsibility for that. I spent a tremendous amount of my time, especially in the first few months, on the schedule, and because we were all new at this, and we wanted to make a good impression. We wanted to make sure that the governor, when he went out, had all the support that he needed, when it came to research, speeches, logistics, transportation, all of those aspects, and advance work for the location where he was speaking. So that took an enormous amount of time.
How long was your day?
My days were very long, and I would typically get to the office at 7 or 7:30 in the morning and not leave until 7 o'clock at night. I would start out the list with perhaps a list of 18 things to do. I had a propensity to write things down, make lists, and I might only get through 4 or 5 of those things during the day, because the governor's office is a place where you're dealing with daily crises, and crisis management is the name of the game in many respects. So we would have an intention to do all kinds of things in a particular day, and a crisis would ensue, or several would ensue that day, and you would have to spend your time on those. And so you had to have a good transmission, I think, in the sense of being able to shift gears.
Clearly, this was a very different kind of a job than your previous one as executive director of the Senate Republicans. Tell us a little bit about compare and contrast.
Well, in the position of chief of staff, the hours are longer. You're dealing with a great variety of subjects and a great variety of people. One of the challenges you had at the beginning of any administration, and I think other chiefs of staff have had the same challenges that I had at that point, is that in a campaign, you have lots of people who at various levels and various ways help the governor get elected. And they all have an interest in pursuing after that for things that they want. And they all think that their part of getting the governor elected was the most important. So, and that includes some of the people on that come into the administration who might come into cabinet positions, sub-cabinet positions, work in the governor's office, and so forth. So coordinating all of that is a major task, and the people who had worked closely in the campaign, who felt who were used to talking one-on-one to the governor regularly, couldn't quite do that when it came to a large administration where you had all the tremendous demands of other things and other people.
Would you say that was your greatest challenge, or what were some of the other challenges as well?
Well, we started out with first of all, the election was so close that some people were saying that the governor really didn't have a mandate, as if that he would have had if he had won by a very large margin. So that was a challenge to deal with, and to be gubernatorial in many respects, but we got over that. The second was the fiscal challenge. We inherited a deficit that ranged up to, at that point, $600 million for the upcoming budget year. And that was a major challenge.
What percentage of the budget was that, just in comparison to today?
Trying to remember the details. It was about the same kind of percentage you're talking about in recent years, where we've had deficits where the total budget is much larger. So that was a real challenge, and there were different thoughts within the administration about how to deal with this. And we had some real lengthy dialogues and intense dialogues about how to go about this. And there were some people who said, well, we need to really cut back on state government. We really have to really cut expenditures sharply and balance the budget that way. And there were others, led by myself and Kerry Edwards, who was the governor's counsel, who said, we think we need to deal with this by getting more revenue. We'll do some expense reduction, but we need to also have some additional revenue, which ultimately resulted in having to have some tax increases. And it turned out that was the way that we went. The governor reluctantly went along with some legislation that was passed to balance the budget, which included an increase in the income tax and the sales tax. And in many respects, that was the most important decision that was made in the beginning of the administration, because it put the state on a better fiscal basis and a firm fiscal basis, and the economy came back. The economy had been down, the economy came back, and so the governor was able to fund the programs that he was interested in, fund state government with some new programs that were important throughout the 8 years without having any huge deficit problems.
If we just step back a little bit and talk about the transition from the Byrne administration to the Kaine administration. Was the Byrne administration helpful in facilitating the transition to the new administration, or were they not helpful?
Well, during the election campaign, there was some sharp exchanges between Governor Kane and Governor Byrne, in the sense that they disagreed on programs, and Governor Kane was critical of the Byrne administration in a number of ways. But after the election, Governor Byrne was very gracious and helpful, and we had a series of meetings. We probably had about 10 different meetings, which included Governor Byrne and his chief of staff, Harold Hodes, and Governor Kane and myself. And we met at all kinds of places. We met at Monmouth Racetrack, we met at the Meadowlands Sports Complex, whenever it fit into the governor's schedules, we would meet. And we might meet for an hour, we might meet for 4 or 5 hours. And we discussed everything and anything. And I think Governor Kane felt, and I certainly felt, that those meetings were extremely helpful. We learned an awful lot. We got a good running start, and we had a good cooperative basis that I think continued right to this day, when Governor Byrne and Governor Kane have a very good relationship.
Who were your closest colleagues in the governor's office?
Let's see. Well, in the governor's office, I worked closely with Kerry Edwards, who was the governor's chief legal counsel, and who was the chief person that we had dealing with the legislature. In the previous administration, the chief of staff, Harold Hodes, had been the chief person to deal with the legislature. We made a change right at the very beginning of the administration and decided that it would be the chief counsel, not the chief of staff, to deal with the legislature. And so Kerry did that, and I worked closely with him on that. I also worked closely with Gary Stein, who was the chief of policy and planning. And Gary and I hadn't known each other well, but we got to know each other well and work closely together. Chris Daggett was my deputy chief of staff. Jim Kennedy was on my staff and was responsible for a lot of the political interaction with different committees around the state. They were some of the key people. How
well did you all get along? And if you would describe their styles.
Well, I think you always are going to have interactions that are going to be both positive and negative. We all had different styles among the top people. First of all, the governor initially was criticized by some people from outside by having 3 principal people report to him instead of 1. But that was his style. That was what he was comfortable with. And after I left and after other changes were made in each of these positions, throughout the 8 years, he continued to have multiple people in charge of the governor's office, not just 1. And that was his style. In terms of personal styles, Kerry Edwards had he was intense. He would work very hard. He lived in Bergen County, and he had a long commute to Trenton, and he would get there later in the morning, and he would work late into the evening, and then he would go out and with some of his staff usually, and have a late meal at the diner on Route 1 before he headed back to Bergen County to go home. Gary Stein lived in Bergen County also, and he would come down, and he had a little more orderly schedule than Kerry did. I lived in Lawrenceville, so I was close, so I would always be the first one in the office in the morning, and I didn't want to stay as late. I had 3 young children at home, and I like to get home. So we all had our different styles. I think we interacted well together. There was good teamwork, I think, generally.
Did Governor Kane, clearly you expressed, Governor Kane had a reputation of encouraging contradictory views within his staff and within his cabinet. From your perspective, did you feel that worked?
Yes. The short answer is yes. I think that the governor did feel comfortable with dealing with different points of view. We didn't hesitate to express our opinions. There were times when we would bring something to his attention and we would give him a recommendation, and perhaps he didn't like it, so we would say, we'll come back and talk about it again. So we might go get some reinforcements and bring some other people in, and then we would do it again. We'd say, Governor, this is what we feel strongly. We think this is the way you should do this. And he clearly was not comfortable with it, and we would press him on it, and then he would finally say what I called the I am the governor speech. I don't want to do it. I've made it clear I don't want to do that. And that was his I am the governor speech. He was the one that ran. He was elected. He was in charge, and he did it, all in a very civil way.
Going back to the cabinet just for a minute, did the cabinet hold meetings?
Yes, there were regular cabinet meetings, but I think it's the general public and other people in politics who are not familiar with it, I think have a different impression of what cabinet meetings are than what the reality of it is. For the most part, cabinet meetings were an opportunity for the governor and his chief staff people to convey information to the cabinet people and policy, and making it clear to them. It was not a place where policy was really discussed at length, and the cabinet members, for the most part, would sit and listen. And I think that's typically the case in most cabinet meetings, whether they be at the United States or New Jersey or other places. You have a lot of opportunities to work with people on policy in individual areas, but when you collectively get together 20 or more people with diverse subject areas, it's a little hard to have a real policy discussion on a particular subject. So it was more information conveying and policy direction from the governor.
How frequently did the cabinet meet?
I believe we met once a month.
Mm-hmm. And did it facilitate intra-departmental communication on issues, or did it not? It
did, but there are lots of other ways in which you communicate with people to deal with the policy. So it wasn't that important a method of doing that.
Let's now talk about Governor Kane. What was he like to work with?
He was a pleasure to work with. He's an easygoing person who is very civil, very polite. He's not a micromanager. He's not a shouter. He's considerate of other people's opinions and their jobs, and so and very intelligent, a good listener, a person that was easy to work with, and I heard stories about other governors. I had some personal experience with other governors and other leaders with different styles. I liked his style.
What would you consider his major strengths and his major weaknesses?
I think he's first of all, he had great integrity, and I think one of the legacies of his administration was integrity. There weren't any scandals. It was a very good 8 years in that respect. So integrity was first. Tremendous knowledge of politics and government that he had learned from the time he was a boy with his father, who was a congressman, and other people in his family, and his service in the legislature. So he had a lot of knowledge there. Third, he knew people in all walks of life, all over the world, really, or the United States. And whenever we had a problem, he would always know somebody that he could call to get some help or advice or whatever. And that was a tremendous resource because he was so knowledgeable and so worldly in that respect. I think his graciousness with people, his genuine interest in people's activities and programs was another one of his great strengths as well.
And what were his weaknesses, if any?
Well, we all have our weaknesses. I would say when he served, and one of the interesting things was when he served in the legislature, he never had served on the Appropriations Committee. So he never really learned about the finances of the state in a real detailed manner. And I think that was a weakness in the sense that he didn't have as much knowledge as some other people might have who would come out of the legislature about the state fiscal situation. So that was something that he had to learn as he went along.
Well, and you said previously his ability to stay on schedule.
Well, that was a weakness, but it was a strength too. It was a challenge for those of us that had to run his schedule, but it was a strength.
What were the major issues during your time in the governor's office?
Well, we had a lot of different challenges in the first year. The fiscal situation and getting the budget balanced was one of the primary ones. So we had to deal with that right away. We also had a rail strike in the first year, and our Commissioner of Transportation and other people had to deal with that. That was a major problem. Other things that came up were unusual. We had a Supreme Court nomination that came up, a vacancy that came up in the first year. And so we had to choose somebody to be on the Supreme Court. And after a process that we went through carefully, the governor selected Marie Garibaldi to be a Supreme Court justice. She had been president of the State Bar Association, a very good person. And so that was a major appointment that we had. And then we had another one, very unusual.
Stay on this for a minute.
Okay.
Because wasn't Marie Garibaldi the first woman to be appointed to the Supreme Court?
She was. And so that was very significant. And there were other good candidates for the position, but I was pleased that the governor selected Marie, and that was historic in that sense. Then there was an unexpected vacancy in the U.S. Senate where Harrison Williams had resigned his seat in the U.S. Senate, and so we had to pick an interim candidate for an interim person to be a U.S. Senator, which is quite extraordinary. And as you can imagine, we had lots and lots of people interested in that whole process and that job. And the governor set up a process to get suggestions. He reached out to a lot of people, and a lot of people gave him suggestions, and he kept a file on his desk, which nobody else saw but the governor and his secretary, as of all the suggestions that he got. And one day I said to him, you know, we haven't really talked much about this, but you know, do you want my thoughts about this? And he said, sure, you know, what do you think? And I said, well, I think of, you know, a lot of really good candidates here, but I said, all things considered, I would be comfortable with Nick Brady as a senator. And he just smiled at me and didn't say anything further. And a week or so later, he made his decision, and it turned out he picked Nick Brady, not because I recommended it, because he felt, and he knew Nick very well, that he would be an excellent person in that job. But that was a major thing that we had to deal with that first year. Another really extraordinary thing happened in the first year, so we had lots of challenges, was that the governor hurt his back. And the governor wound up in St. Barnabas Hospital up in Livingston for about 6 weeks, and it turned out we wound up running the state of New Jersey from St. Barnabas Hospital while he was there. And we had to establish communications up there and run back and forth between Trenton and Livingston, and that was a real challenge.
Pre-computer, pre-internet.
Yes, absolutely. We didn't have all of those communication tools we have today, but the governor was in bed in Livingston, in St. Barnabas Hospital in traction for a while, and finally got through it, and fortunately did not have to have surgery. So that was a real challenge. It was unusual to have to deal with that.
Let me go back again to the Marie Garibaldi appointment. We previously discussed Len Coleman's role in the governor's outreach to the minority community. Clearly, the appointment of Marie Garibaldi was a signal to the then emerging women's movement in New Jersey that Governor Kane was certainly attuned to appointing more women to his administration. And although Marie Garibaldi was not the only one, and there are women in his administration who rose up to be cabinet members, etc. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. One of the key people in that respect was Jane Bergio, who had been an assembly person and from Essex County, knew the governor very, very well, and she became Secretary of State. And the governor had a lot of confidence in her. She had good access to the governor. She was a good person in that respect. Another person who was a strong person in that regard was Hazel Gluck from Ocean County, who had been a member of the legislature, very strong person. And I believe Hazel started out as director of the State Lottery Commission. She was very interested in the job, and that was the job that we started out with for her. And she was a strong advocate for certainly for women, but also for the governor's programs. And she moved on from there to do other cabinet positions.
I believe she went on. She was briefly Commissioner of Insurance,
right?
And then she became Commissioner of Transportation in the end of the governor's term.
Yeah, and so those are some good examples of people, some women who played key roles in the administration from the beginning right on through.
You talked about your role in really that you became chief of staff in troubled economic times, similar to what we're going through now in 2010. And you talked about the fact that the governor, although he didn't want to, signed a tax increase. Were there other fiscal measures that the administration did early on to put it on a firmer economic footing than it was when you first came into the administration?
In the transportation area, the need for capital spending, capital programs to build roads and other transportation facilities was important, and the Transportation Trust Fund was put together in that respect, and that was a major vehicle for funding long-term transportation projects, and that was a very important aspect.
How would you assess the Kane administration as a whole?
Well, I would give the Kane administration high marks. I think that I would give him certainly a very high mark for integrity, first of all, which is really important. There were no real scandals. They went through 8 years with a good record in that respect. I think in part because of actions taken in the first year to get additional revenues, there was a fiscally sound approach that was taken and utilized over 8 years. And fortunately, the economy came back, so tax revenues increased as well. So it was fiscally sound. I think from a communication standpoint, I think the governor had a good rapport with the voters of the state. He is a person who related well to various people, various ethnic groups. Diversity of people throughout the state was shown by his reelection by a large margin. I think another key thing was that he helped to restore pride in the state. There were people who used to belittle, and sometimes they still do, New Jersey, but I think a number of things were done to build on the pride of the state. During the governor's administration, we had 2 professional sports teams that came to New Jersey, the Jets and the Devils, hockey team, and that was important, and all of that helped to build the pride of the state.
What were his most disappointing defeats?
It's hard to remember all. I would say that I think that there was in the field of education, it was one of the things that was done was to take over some school districts, Newark and Jersey City in particular, and I think the fact that there wasn't greater improvement faster in the field of urban education was a disappointment, despite the state takeovers, and I think that was something that was a problem. I think the governor always wanted to, because he was such a strong supporter of the arts, would always have wanted to have more dollars available to spend for culture and arts, and that's a bit of a disappointment as well.
Lou, once you left as chief of staff, what was your next job in the administration? And tell us a little bit about your subsequent career.
Okay, happy to do that. I moved from the governor's office to the Meadowlands Sports Complex. I joined the staff of the New Jersey Sports and Exposition Authority as the chief operating officer, and my title changed over the 9 years that I spent there, but I was basically, I was probably more accurately, I was the chief administrative officer. I oversaw the administrative functions of the sports authority, and excuse me, and we operated the Meadowlands Sports Complex, the Giants Stadium, the Meadowlands Arena, and Monmouth Park Racetrack, as well as Meadowlands Racetrack, and that was a challenge. It was an interesting job. I enjoyed it. Unlike what some people might think, we weren't out there every week advising Phil Simms on how to play football or whatever. We were the landlords. We had a responsibility of maintaining the facilities, and in that respect, one of my responsibilities was oversee the engineering and construction aspects, and so we built a new restaurant in the arena. We revamped the Meadowlands racetrack, and did a number of other important things in that respect. So it was an interesting, fun kind of job, and I enjoyed that a lot. After that, I had an opportunity when Governor Whitman came into office subsequently to manage another one of the state large authorities, which is something that I'd wanted to do, and that was the New Jersey Highway Authority, which was responsible for the Garden State Parkway and the Garden State Arts Center. And so I had that responsibility, and for the last 7 years of my career, that's what I did. I managed those facilities.
Thank you, Lou. It has really been a pleasure speaking to you this afternoon.
That's been my pleasure, Nancy. Thank you.